This morning, basically, what I wanted to do is go through a personal testimony of translation and then take some principles of translation, of things we've learned that we can apply to our lives. And I'd like to begin in the book of Psalms, Psalm 32. Verse 8 and 9. And God says, I will instruct thee and teach thee in the way which thou shalt go. I will guide thee with mine eye. Be ye not as the horse or as the mule, which have no understanding, whose mouth must be held in with bit and bridle, lest they come near unto thee. And so we see that God promises, I will instruct you, I will guide you, I will take you. If you will listen to me, I'll take you where you need to go. Now, my early childhood was a bit unusual in that my parents went to China in 1940, and in 1941 we were moved to the Philippine Islands for safety's sake, but it wasn't very safe. And so we were put in a prisoner of war camp during most of World War II. We were released just before VE Day, and in fact, we arrived on VE Day in May in San Francisco. Then after that, the Lord put in my heart to be a medical missionary to Africa at age 11, and didn't have any money. Excuse me. But I was a good student. Thank you. And so I was able to get scholarships going through college and then eventually medical school. Thanks so much. And with the scholarships, was able to finish, went to 2 years of internship, 2 years of residency, 2 years of fellowship, 2 years in the 2 years in public health service, and at age 33, I was finally ready for my first real job. So we went to Liberia, West Africa. Now, how we went to Liberia is rather is significant. I'll come back to that. I wrote to 20 medical schools my last year of training, and I was very well trained as an internist, saying I am a trained cardiologist with and board certified in internal medicine. Are you interested? Well, most were not. But one fellow was very interested in our coming, a fellow from Nigeria, and we wrote back and forth, and he was talking about salary, which was, by the way, inadequate. I think it was like $7,000 a year or something like that. And what kind of equipment I would need and that sort of thing. And then I got a disc, probably moving a patient, and my foot went numb, and I'm lying on my back thinking that a neurosurgeon is going to operate on my spine. And I'm put on 5 weeks of bed rest, and halfway through, the telephone rings, and a guy calls me and says, I'm so-and-so from the U.S. Public Health Hospital. We'd like to offer you a job as head of the Department of Medicine in a new medical school starting up in Liberia. I said, I'm trained as a cardiologist. He said, I know that. But he said, you're a board-certified internist, and you'd have the entire country. Think about it. Well, I'm lying on my back with, and I can't wear the heavy laid aprons anymore that cardiologists wear, seeing my career go down, so I decided to take the job. We go then to Liberia a year later, and we had 5 wonderful years of medical practice there, and in fact, I was decorated for my time there, and then the more significant thing that occurred was I got saved while I was in Liberia. I had grown up. You said, well, weren't you overseas as a pastor, as a missionary? Yeah, but he was saved, but he grew up in a liberal background, and I never learned how to get saved. And so while I was in Liberia, a good friend of mine, doctor friend of mine, his wife, their transformed lives kept bugging me, and I finally ended up accepting the Lord and got saved. Gave up my academic career to come back to the United States. Worked in a Christian group for 10 years, and then what happened was a fellow by the name of Darrell Champlin came and preached, and my wife and I both felt we were called. So we went to to Suriname, initially for a look-see, and then 2 years later we went. Now we are 48 years old at this point in time, and we're working on language learning, and I was still teaching in the medical school in the mornings. To keep our foot in the door, but my primary purpose was church planting. And 9 months later, we started our first church. And during that first tour, we had started a church, started training national pastors, and I was continuing to teach medicine in the mornings. Came back, and my wife had been talking with me, and she said, these guys, these young internists that are here, there were 4 of them, could really run the program now. They didn't have the experience before, but now they do. Why don't you just resign and do church work? Well, I didn't want to resign and do church work. I liked being a doctor, and I was good at it, and I liked the prestige, and I did some soul winning at the time and so forth. And the next morning when I got up, I had a disc again. I said, uh-oh, because the last time I got a disc, God moved me from my plan to go to Nigeria to Liberia. It worked out well. And I had this sneaking suspicion that God was working in my life. Well, about 4 days later, Andre Galone comes, knocks on the door, comes in, says, I came to pray for you. I said, thank you very much. Now, Andre, I taught to read. He was also my soul winning partner. He had never gone past, I think, 1st or 2nd grade. And so he said, Domini, he said, do you know why you're sick? Domini is pastor. And I thought to myself, well, who are you to tell me why I'm sick when I'm the doctor and you're the guy I taught to read? But I said, why am I sick? And he said, because you're one man and you're trying to be 2 men. And I thought about that, and I said, what do you mean? He said, you're trying to be a doctor and a pastor, and you can't do both. Well, I didn't particularly appreciate his diagnosis, and so I was sitting there thinking about things, and about 6 hours later, in comes Kolai Amafo, who had not been in church for 1.5 years. I hadn't seen him. I was so surprised. I said, what are you doing here, Kolai? So he said, I came to pray for you. I said, well, thank you. And after he prayed for me, he looked at me and said, do you know why you're sick? And now I had this sinking feeling in my stomach, something, and he told me exactly the same words, and I knew these guys hadn't met. And so I knew at that point that God was dealing with me. But you always have, I shouldn't say you always, but maybe you have a little bit of doubt. So I said, Lord, I struggled with it for about 10 days before I really decided I better listen to God. And I said, but I would like a sign. And so I said, I tried to get on radio, and I said, I'd like to be on radio at SRS, which is the national radio station. I'd try to get on a rinky-dink station, and they didn't want me. Now I'm trying for the national radio station. I said I want it between 6:15 and 6:30, Monday through Friday, because they had the News in Suriname, the news in Suriname before that, and then they had 15 minutes of music, and then they had the death announcements, and all Bush Negroes had to listen to the death announcements to see if it was in their family. So you had a captive audience automatically. Well, I go and I resign from the hospital. They're sad. I'm sad, but God's glad. And then I go and to SRS, and to my amazement, not knowing a soul, I walk out with a contract for exactly that 15-minute block. Thank you, Lord. So at this point in time, I was convinced that God wanted me out of medicine and doing his work full-time. And during the years before that, I had been very frustrated because I felt my primary goal is to train nationals and plant churches and have nationals run churches, and we didn't have anything in the Old Testament at all, nothing. A real old translation of the Bible, which was not such a great translation in the New Testament, but it was usable, but nothing in the Old Testament except for the book of Psalms. And I had been thinking, well, when I get to be age 60, I will retire, and then I will, maybe I'll translate, because that's the usual retirement age in Suriname. Then I'll translate from then on. I was only 53 at this time. So I decided then, knowing that God had brought me out, that I ought to get started in translating, and so I started translating Monday through Friday, the time I would spend for as a doctor, okay? Just switched over. And so I started translating, and I developed a team of these young guys that were training. Ultimately, we had 7 young Surinamers that we were using. And so I would translate a piece, and then I would give it to 2 people. And then I would correct based on their independent translation corrections. Then I would give the corrected copy to 2 more and go through the same process, each of them independently. Then I get that back, and I'd take 2 more, and I'd correct that as well. So we were, at that point in time, we were running actually 4 different levels of things simultaneously. I was doing the original work. I'd read a commentary. I'd read through it, and you said, well, did you get Hebrew and Greek in medical school? No. No, I did not. So I did the next best thing, and that's another thing I wanted to talk to you about. I had to struggle as to what text should I use. And we were in a situation where I grew up, and we had a fine pastor, and I really had a lot of respect for him. And he had been trained at a couple institutions, which were critical text institutions, one of which is not too far from here. Brother Ledford, you shouldn't laugh like that. You know what I'm talking about. And that our pastor had warned us. He said, now, Bob, when you go on deputation, he said, you're going to find some of these churches that you may end up going to some churches that believe that the King James Version is the right version to use. And he said, don't let that throw you off. Don't get too upset about that. But he said that you just prepare yourself. Well, as I thought back on it, the 4 largest churches where we had gone were, number 1 was, one of them was First Baptist Church of Milford. Was one of the 4. Also, Massillon Baptist Temple. A third one was the largest independent Baptist church in Michigan by Dr. Ulat. And a 4th one is a large independent church just over the line in Chesterton, Indiana, Dr. Volkland. And I thought, wait a minute. Now, these are good men, and these guys are not dumb, and these guys are sharp, and they are all KJV guys. How, I'd better take a good look at this situation. So now I start to study. That's why I'm so glad that Brother Rockwell was able to bring out this material. In fact, I want to get some because he's got a lot more stuff than I'd learned. And I thought I was in pretty good shape. I've read about 30 books, but I think he's read a whole lot more than that, especially with the background. And I came to the discovery that it was, I thought, well, because I do not know Hebrew and Greek, I will not be able to understand. That is not true. Because the issue is not the translation of this word or that word in the Greek text. In the Greek, the issue is what Greek text are you going to use, and what are the Greek words? And I found several books, a couple books by Dr. Waite, very helpful. I have a book by Dean Burgeon that was there. And particularly helpful, I found a book by David Sorensen called Touch Not the Unclean Thing, which was extremely helpful because David Sorensen had gone through the same process himself and lost a whole lot of friends in the process. So I decided I would translate using the KJV. This created some problems for us, because my national helpers were working, they had to work off a language. The Dutch language was done in a critical text. And so I had to take them back to an English text, KJV, and the KJV is not the easiest text for a non-English speaking person to understand. Now, what I did not know, if I had known that, it would have been very helpful, was that the Statenvertaling, the state translation is what that means. Statenvertaling, translated back in the 16th century, is virtually identical to the translation of the KJV. And you put the two side by side, no problem. Well, this created some problems now with my translation as I went on, because I would find them translating, and I said, hey, that's not what I said. So then I go to them, I say, but look, but they said, but Domini, and they'd take out I said, but you can't use that critical text. This is missing. That's missing. This has been changed. There were a few other interesting things we did have to adapt, like the numbering system. By the way, the one thing we did do is take the Dutch numbering system, because they work in Dutch. For example, it's quite different in a couple places. For instance, the Dutch count in the Psalms where it has an introduction, that's verse 1, or sometimes verse 1 and 2. So you'll find your verses numbers are different, so you have to adjust to that. There are a few differences, like Isaiah 9, 6, and 7, Isaiah 9, 5, and 6. You have to know that, or you're one verse off a couple places. But that's just arbitrary stuff. Okay, so now we start. So I go now to about 2 months after, my wife brings me, said, you need to read this. She brings me something from the Dutch newspaper, and there it said that SIL had decided they would resume and complete a translation of the entire Bible in Suriname Tango. This is what I was going to do. I said, what should I do? Because they're the experts and I'm not. And so I went and talked with them briefly, and I took my very, very rough draft of Exodus. They had done something in Genesis before, so I didn't want to have something that someone else had done before. I wanted to start from scratch. And they looked at it. They were very kind, and I said, well, it looks like you've put a lot of work in it. That's all. They didn't say anything about working together, and they didn't say anything also about that they thought it was great or not. And I said, well, can you help me? And they said, sure. And I said, do you have any books on translation you can give me? And they said, sure. So they loaned me a book by Eugene Nida, 520 pages long. And Eugene Nida is a very, very persuasive writer, very persuasive. He is the guru of the dynamic equivalence movement. But as I read and read, I kept seeing, hey, this gives me an awful lot of flexibility as to what I can do. And I'm afraid there's going to be too much of me in this. And I'd already remembered reading the last chapter of the book, and Revelation 18 gives some strange, strong warnings about not changing things. So I said, hey, this isn't going to work. Another thing that happened during this time, and I'm mentioning these because I think you'll see how the pattern comes. Brother Ledford, I think, is following my reasoning. Another thing that was very interesting that happened is a lady came to church one day with a baby who was very sick. Nobody could figure out why this baby was sick. They took her to the pediatrician, couldn't figure out. She just wouldn't eat, failure to thrive is what we call it. And so I said, okay, Anita, let's pray for the baby. And so afterwards, she and I sat down in the church and we prayed for the baby. Well, guess what? The baby got well. The Lord did something. I was delighted. And so she started coming, and after a short period of time, she got saved. So in doing some follow-up lessons, I asked her to if she would be willing to read the text in this older translation, read the text to me, and I would explain it. And my mouth dropped open because she read beautifully. How did she know how to read like that? So we put her on our translation team. It turns out that she had been during her unsaved period of time, she had been one of the translators for Wycliffe. Gotten saved, and now ended up working with us. Well, we went through then for the next several years, 3 years, we went through the entire Bible using this method that I mentioned. And in 3 years, remember, we hadn't had all the linguistic work had already been done years before, so I didn't have to do that. In 3 years, we had completed the Bible. I'd take it to Dr. Keene, and Dr. Keene said something extremely important. He said, Bob, do not hurry. Take your time. Be accurate. Make sure that you're doing it right. So I had two people. One was the lady I told you about. The other is Mikhail Raffenberg. Now, Mikhail Raffenberg, at the present time, is Undersecretary of State for the country of Suriname. Rather talented young man. At that time, he was a college kid getting trained in law. A good background for a translator. And he needed a job. So his part-time job was the two of them, and so we took the rough translation through what we had done, and we had the three of us work. They would work independently, and then I would work on it, and we would keep on working on this. We went through it 4 more times, 7 times before we finished the whole thing. By this time, we had pretty much worked out the things. And during this time, my sister-in-law, Joanna Tsuki, had said, Bob, what are you going to do about layout? Layout? I didn't know anything about layout. Well, that's before the days of supercomputer, everything goes, you know. You have to lay the thing out. I said, well, I hadn't thought about it, Joanna. She said, well, you know, Bob, she said, she's a secretary, but she said, my part-time job is to lay out books for people. She said, would you like me to do it? I said, well, Joanna, what's the cost? She said, you can't afford me, so it's nothing. And so she did. And this was, you know, this was before, it was not, email was just becoming available. I mean, you couldn't just zap stuff back and forth. She would print stuff out on her printer and send it by mail, and then we would get it. We'd send it by mail back. This is back and forth from Suriname. You know, you get 50 pages or 100 pages going back and forth, and she did it. And then she made out the layouts to go to Bearing Precious Seed. In the meantime, I was trying to save some money and figure it out. And Daryl Champlin, who was our field director, had spoken many times and was a good friend of Dr. Keene, and he's spoken many times at First Baptist at Bearing Precious Seed. So he and Dr. Keene were talking, and so Dr. Keene and he were talking, and he said, how is Dr. Patton going to pay for this printing? He said, well, I don't know. I guess he's saving some money or something about it. He said, well, he doesn't have to do that. So Bearing Precious Seed printed our first Bible. So I go to Dr. Keene, and he's all excited because we're coming, and he's working on it to get this thing done. And he wants to pass out a John and Romans to all the people at the church before we start. So, and he does. So I said, Dr. Keene, I said, can I ask you something? He said, sure. He said, you're going to give me 5,000 Bibles. But I said, could I have maybe 10,000 John Romans? He said, no. But you can have 50,000. And so we had 50,000. And then later on, Seedline sent us another 50,000. Now, Seedline there was a small technical problem, which has created a problem for us, and that is that humidity is tremendous in Suriname. It is a tropical paradise for jungle. And so the nails or I shouldn't say, the wire that holds the thing together tended to rust and leave a rust stain around it, which was a problem. But other than that, we haven't finished distributing all the John and Romans yet. But we had 100,000. We've distributed the first group. The second group we had distributed. Okay, so now we are ready to print, and we get the books there, and we were going to have them distributed. And so a fellow in our church said, I will help you distribute. Well, he used to work as the distributor for SIL and the Bible Kanotskap. He said, well, I know these people, and I'll help you distribute. Well, it didn't work out, and he left there, and he also left our church, and so that fell apart, and I didn't know what to do. And so I started to try and go around, and the groups that had been working with Wycliffe in distributing Bibles were not happy to see me. So I didn't know what to do. And then a fellow by the name of Steve Giamo said, I will distribute for you. He was the head of Het Goede Boek, which is the good book distributor for the Baptists. Okay? And so he took it on, and it has been a blessing for him and a blessing for us. A blessing for him in that he was able to get some funds from it, and a tremendous blessing for us because it was distributed. The first distribution group that went through was 5,000. Took 5 years for that 5,000 to be used. Now, what we did is we sold it at a reduced rate. We sold it at below the normal cost of any of the other Bibles, but we sold it deliberately because if we hadn't, it would have been picked up by hustlers and sold on the street. We took the funds, kept them in a separate account, converted them to dollars, and repaid ourselves for the cost of bringing the books in. And we've done that ever since. And the money that remained above that, we sent back to Bearing Precious Seed so they could print for someone else or us. I mean, it's only fair. And so we've done that. The first printing was 5,000. It took 5 years. The second printing was 5,000, and it took 3 years. So actually the amount went up. The third printing was 10,000, and at that time we were also given 20,000 New Testaments, which were printed with just a plain paper cover, rather simple, that we used for distribution. And again, we were careful not to just put them out, otherwise they're gone. Hustlers will sell them and so forth. But they have gone to such places as the jail ministries. We take them to the hospital. I sent them up to Mungo, and they put them in all the middle bars, that is the secondary schools. All the kids got them. Sent them to the Evangelical Methodist, not the Evangelical Methodist. Yes, we did send them. The Evangelical Methodists got them. We sent them actually to the Moravians, and they were distributed again. So those have gone out, and they were just about almost finished when we left. The fourth printing for 10,000 has also been here. We've had a few technical problems. One time the wrong type of glue was used in the paper. The covers came off. It had to be re-glued. Last time there was a printing error. Whoever proofread the front cover failed to send it to me or to have themselves do it, and they missed them. There was a typo on it, so they made a cover that you can plaque on it and put on it and so forth. What are the benefits since then? Since then, first of all, we can preach in throughout the entire Bible and reference back and forth with no problems. Secondly, the same lady who read so beautifully read into my tape recorder, and her voice started appearing on the radio station. And I started with Matthew 1:1, went through the New Testament, then went back and went straight through the Old Testament. And we have made about 2,100 15-minute recordings. And they are on the air every day. They'll be on today. They'll be on tomorrow. Every day there are recordings. We're on 3 different stations, varying periods of time. It allowed us to put stuff on television. And I'm on television twice a week. And I use the present tense because it's DVD and it's on twice a week. One of them is chronological and the other is doctrinal. And many Pentecostal people will listen to us because the doctrinal training they have is very weak. And so we get quite a few people who are non-Baptist, who are not unsaved, although we get unsaved people listening too. We've seen this, we use it as pre-evangelism. There's a brief gospel message at the very beginning of every broadcast so that we give pre-evangelism. We've seen maybe 1 or 2 people saved, but what makes difference is when you go soul winning, they immediately know who you are and they're familiar with the gospel. And you've got credibility. And so when they're confronted directly, then we see that. The Bible Institute was possible to now have the Old and New Testament in the Bible Institute in Tongo. Immediately the number of students went up. And it's now being used in the interior. I put it also on DVD. And so with the help of my partners. And so the Bible Institute is still going on with my voice and their projection is going up, and they have one of the pastors is the expediter. All of these things. Commentary. As time went on, we realized our people needed a commentary, and so we started a commentary, and First Bible actually printed a commentary for us. I had done it already once. I redid it, and they printed it. We got it this just before we left. 500 and some copies of it, of the New Testament. It's about 800 and some pages long. And so all of these things have been possible since that time. What is interesting is that Wycliffe is still working, by the way, on the Old Testament, and that has been since ours was done in 1998. So this is, 15 years later. The New Testament, which they had done, was printed. I took the New Testament of their New Testament and our New Testament. I put it in Dutch, and I put it in Suriname, and you can see the difference between the critical text and the traditional text. You can see it very easily. And some things are very subtle. If you don't know, you miss them. For example, the Bible says in the traditional text, Jesus, Mary and his father took Jesus to the temple for dedication. But if you look at the critical text, it says his father and his mother. Very subtle. It said that she went for her cleaning, to cleanse herself. In the traditional text, she said that she went for their cleansing. In the critical text, very subtle. God is come in the flesh, according to 1 Timothy 3:16, but not in the critical text. It refers to he, not. So you can put in whoever you want for he has come in the flesh, not God in the flesh, or Christ. And so there's things are very, plus of course the 47 verses that are missing and the 147 or so pieces that are missing between the two. In, for example, the NIV. So it's very, and has been blessed. Now, they did finish their New Testament, printed 10,000. First day, they had a big blast, and a lot of people came, and the Southern Baptist guy went up and bought 3,000 of them at one shot. That's 30,000 Suriname dollars right on the spot. No, I think $30,000 actually right on the spot, but it's not really caught a hold. And Steve himself and his brother and his worker Frank started to read it, and they said, this isn't Bible. Well, I will stop at this point. I think that there might be one or two questions, brother, if you want to raise any questions. But I think you see how the whole thing evolved. Any questions that you might have? But, to bring back, let's just summarize one or two things to finish this up. Number one, God says, I will, he said, I will lead you, point one. Next thing I would like to say is that God uses the foolish things of this world to confound the wise, and including doctors who don't know Hebrew and Greek, if he chooses. Now, I would have been better learning Hebrew and Greek, yes. He also uses, and he told Paul, my weakness is made perfect. My strength is made perfect in your weakness. I was weak in language. I was strong in medicine. He takes me out of medicine, puts that aside, uses language. Why? To show himself strong. Not to show I'm so great. And the point is, were there things that would have been better? Yes, it would have been better if I had known Hebrew and Greek. No question about it. Because every time you translate to a different language, you lose something. No question about it. I would have been better off if I had had a trustworthy language consultant that I could trust. But I did not feel I could go to the experts because they came from a different philosophy. Okay? I didn't know about back translation. That's a very simple thing. You go from the Suriname, go back to English, see if you missed something. Very simple to do. I didn't know about that. Had I known about that, I would have done that. So there are some simple things that could be done that would be much better. But the ultimate point I want to bring down is, if God can use me, he can use you. That's the ultimate point. You don't need to make all the mistakes that I made. You don't need to struggle with all the things. You can get a better background than I can have. But if God can use me, he can use you. And if he calls you to do it, he will enable you to do it. That, I think, is the bottom line.